December 18, 1943, 11:47 hours. Ortona, Abruzzo region, eastern Italy. Temperature hovering at 4 degrees Celsius. Dense fog rolling off the Adriatic, reducing visibility to 43 meters. The air thick with cordite residue and the wet copper smell of blood mixing with pulverized masonry dust. Sergeant Harold William Thompson, 26 years old, lies motionless on the third floor of a gutted apartment building, his body pressed against rubble that was once someone's dining room wall, fingers wrapped around the stock of a No. 4 MQI Lee Enfield rifle, with such tension that knuckles have turned the color of exposed bone. In the previous 11 days of house-to-house combat through Ortona's medieval streets, Thompson has fired 47 rounds and claimed 47 confirmed kills, each one meticulously recorded in a blood-stained notebook he carries in his left breast pocket, each entry including distance, wind conditions, time of death. But numbers alone fail to capture the transformation that warfare enacts upon a human nervous system. Thompson's hands no longer shake before firing. His breathing has adopted the mechanical rhythm of a metronome set to 58 beats per minute. His eyes have developed the 1,000-yard stare that physicians will later categorize as acute combat stress reaction, but which soldiers in 1943 simply called the look. He is hunting a German officer who, according to intercepted radio communications, commands the 90th Panzer Grenadier Division's defensive positions in the northern sector, a man whose tactical decisions have cost Canadian forces 134 lives in the past 72 hours. But now something different. In exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes, Thompson will accomplish what military analysts from the Canadian Army Historical Section will later describe as the single most impactful sniper engagement in the Italian campaign, a shot that will change tactical doctrine across 3 Allied nations and force German High Command to issue emergency protocols regarding officer movement in contested urban terrain. The Germans had superior numbers, holding fortified positions they had spent 6 weeks reinforcing with steel-reinforced concrete, anti-tank obstacles, pre-registered artillery coordinates, and interlocking fields of fire that had already destroyed 14 Sherman tanks and killed or wounded over 800 Canadian infantry. They had meticulously prepared killing zones, observation posts equipped with Zeiss optics superior to anything the Allies possessed, and decades of institutional military expertise encoded in their tactical manuals. They had everything a defending force could want. But Thompson and the men of the 1st Canadian Infantry Division had something the Germans couldn't prepare for, couldn't fully comprehend until their officers started dying at distances and in conditions that made conventional marksmanship impossible, something that German soldiers would begin documenting in diaries and letters with a single word that combined fear and grudging respect: Geister, ghosts. Before we can understand what happens in those 4 hours and 17 minutes, before the mathematics of trajectory and the physics of bullet penetration, we need to understand how Thompson arrived at that rubble-strewn floor with the cold-blooded competence of a professional executioner, and why German doctrine, despite its sophistication and battlefield validation, couldn't internalize what was coming. To understand why December 18, 1943, represented such a psychological and tactical shock for the Wehrmacht forces defending Ortona, you need to go back to September 1939 and the foundational assumptions that shaped German military thinking throughout the war's early years. German infantry doctrine in 1939-1943 was built on the concept of Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics, a command philosophy dating back to Prussian reforms after the Napoleonic Wars, and refined through analysis of 53 major engagements between 1806 and 1918. The system granted junior officers extraordinary autonomy within commander's intent, trusting lieutenants and hauptmanns to make rapid decisions without waiting for orders from higher echelon, a flexibility that had proven devastatingly effective in Poland, where German forces achieved 5.2.1 casualty ratios, in France where they accomplished in 6 weeks what Imperial Germany couldn't achieve in 4 years, and in the Soviet Union where initial advances covered over 700 kilometers in under 3 months. This doctrine was formulated by Generaloberst Hans von Seeckt, who commanded the Reichswehr from 1920 to 1926, a man who had studied at the Prussian War Academy under the tutelage of Alfred von Schlieffen himself, and who believed that warfare was fundamentally about tempo, about making decisions faster than the enemy could react. Von Seeckt's doctrine assumed that officers were the nervous system of the Wehrmacht, that their ability to assess, decide and communicate transformed individual soldiers into a cohesive organism capable of outthinking and outmaneuvering numerically superior forces. The entire edifice of German tactical success rested on a simple premise: protect the decision-makers. German confidence in this system wasn't abstract theory disconnected from battlefield reality. In the invasion of France, Wehrmacht forces suffered approximately 49,000 killed versus 120,000 French dead and 360,000 British and French captured, achieving complete strategic victory with casualty rates that military historians still study as examples of tactical excellence. At Gazala in North Africa, June 1942, Rommel's Afrika Korps destroyed over 600 British tanks while losing only 114 of their own, a 5.31 kill ratio achieved primarily through superior officer initiative at the company and battalion level. At Kharkov in March 1943, SS Obergruppenführer Paul Hausser's forces recaptured the city and inflicted over 45,000 Soviet casualties while suffering less than 12,000 losses, again validating the doctrine that decentralized command with aggressive, well-trained officers produced results that centralized Soviet command structures couldn't match. Technical superiority reinforced this confidence. German optics, produced primarily by Zeiss and Leitz, offered light transmission rates of 92% compared to 78% in British equivalents, meaning German officers could identify targets in low-light conditions where Allied observers saw only shadows. The Wehrmacht standard officer equipment included 6 Vaux 30 binoculars, weighing just 420 grams that could resolve a human face at 1,200 meters under ideal conditions, compared to British 7L50 binoculars that weighed 1,100 grams and could barely distinguish uniform details beyond 800 meters. German officers carried Walter P38 pistols with 8-round magazines and double-action triggers that could be fired accurately to 40 meters, supplemented by MP40 submachine guns capable of 500 rounds per minute. More importantly, officers were trained at institutions like the Kriegsschule in Dresden and the Infantry Schule in Doberitz, where they spent 16 months learning not just tactics, but the cognitive frameworks for rapid decision-making under stress, completing over 300 tactical problems, participating in 96 hours of map exercises, and executing 42 field problems that simulated everything from platoon-level ambushes to battalion-scale breakthroughs. This wasn't ignorance. German intelligence services, particularly the Abwehr and military intelligence branches attached to field armies, possessed information-gathering capabilities that Allied counterintelligence officers described as comprehensive to the point of unsettling. In Italy specifically, German intelligence had correctly identified the 1st Canadian Infantry Division's arrival, knew they were veterans of Sicily, where they'd performed competently but not spectacularly, had accurate estimates of Canadian artillery strength at 144 field guns and 48 medium guns, and possessed demographic intelligence indicating that many Canadian soldiers were 1st or 2nd generation immigrants with limited combat experience compared to Wehrmacht veterans who'd survived 2 to 4 years of Eastern Front combat. They knew Canadian equipment specifications, had captured training manuals that detailed tactical doctrine, and had interrogated prisoners who revealed that Canadian forces relied heavily on artillery support and were uncomfortable with close-quarters urban combat. What German intelligence failed to grasp, what their institutional framework couldn't fully internalize until officers started dying in circumstances that violated every assumption about effective engagement ranges and environmental limitations, was the hunting culture that shaped Canadian marksmanship. The Wehrmacht understood sniping as a specialized military skill taught through formal courses at facilities like the Sniper School at Vilnius, where students spent 6 weeks learning ballistics, camouflage, and range estimation, then deployed as specialist pairs operating under strict tactical guidelines. What they didn't understand was that thousands of Canadian soldiers had spent childhoods hunting in environments that demanded patience measured in hours, concealment against prey, with senses far more acute than human perception, and first-shot accuracy at distances exceeding 300 meters, because a missed shot meant no food and ammunition was expensive. German intelligence possessed these facts, but couldn't process their implications. Reports noted that 68% of Canadian infantry came from rural areas versus 41% of Wehrmacht infantry, that hunting licenses in Canada numbered 1.2 million in a population of 11 million versus 400,000 licenses in Germany's population of 69 million, and that Canadian sporting rifles commonly used .30-06 Springfield or .303 British cartridges at ranges German hunters considered excessive. But intelligence officers, trained in institutions that emphasized formal military education over practical field skills, interpreted this data as indicating that Canadians were provincials with civilian shooting habits that would prove inadequate against professional military snipers using superior optics and proper tactical employment. This epistemological failure had concrete consequences. The irony of German preparation for the Italian campaign reveals itself in captured logistics documents from 11th Panzer Corps dated November 1943, which show Wehrmacht forces in Ortona received reinforced concrete for fortifications, 4,800 anti-personnel mines, 1788mm anti-tank guns positioned to interdict the coastal road, and prefabricated steel obstacles weighing between 280 and 450 kilograms each, positioned to channelize Canadian armor into pre-registered kill zones. They prepared brilliantly for the battle they expected. Armor-heavy combined arms assault, supported by artillery preparation and close air support, the Allied template validated in North Africa and Sicily. What they didn't prepare for, what their doctrine had no framework to address, was fighting an enemy who treated urban warfare not as military science, but as large-scale hunting, where patience trumped aggression, where a single well-placed rifle shot could achieve effects that required an entire platoon using conventional tactics, and where the hunter accepted hour-long periods of absolute immotility as normal operating procedure. German defensive preparations in Ortona focused on stopping tanks and massed infantry, but allocated minimal resources to counter sniper operations. Documents captured after the city's fall show that the 90th Panzer Grenadier Division possessed only 11 dedicated counter-sniper rifles, mostly captured Soviet Mosin Nagants with PU scopes, versus 43 machine gun positions and 19 anti-tank positions. They built interlocking fields of fire, optimized for targets moving at infantry assault speed of 4 kilometers per hour, but created multiple positions where officers could observe streets from static locations, positions that offered excellent fields of fire, but made the observers themselves stationary targets. Wehrmacht tactical doctrine emphasized officer presence at forward positions during critical operations, ensuring that hauptmanns and majors could personally assess situations and make rapid decisions, never fully calculating that this doctrine made them identifiable and predictable targets for adversaries who measured time in hours and considered 300-meter shots routine rather than exceptional. Harold William Thompson was born on March 17, 1917 in Pembroke, Ontario, a lumber town of 12,000 souls on the Ottawa River, where winter temperatures reached -32 degrees Celsius and summer mosquitoes were thick enough to suffocate unwary travelers. His father, James Robert Thompson, worked as a head sawyer at the M.J. O'Brien lumber mill, operating a massive vertical saw that converted white pine logs into boards at a rate of 8 logs per hour, earning $4.80 per 10-hour day, 6 days a week. His mother, Margaret Ann Ney Robertson, died when Harold was 11 years old, succumbing to puerperal sepsis after delivering Harold's stillborn sister, leaving James to raise 3 boys alone in a 4-room company house that cost $8 monthly rent. Harold had 2 brothers, William, 3 years older, who would die at Dieppe on August 19, 1942, machine-gunned on Blue Beach before reaching German wire, and Robert, 2 years younger, who worked the lumber camps and avoided conscription through essential industry deferment. The family attended St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church irregularly, mainly for community connection rather than religious conviction, though Margaret had been devout, and her death shook James's faith to non-existence. Harold completed 8th grade at Pembroke Collegiate Institute, achieving adequate but unremarkable grades, particularly struggling with mathematics and French, before family finances forced him to leave school 3 months before his 15th birthday. He wanted to attend Ottawa Technical School and train as an aircraft mechanic, an aspiration that died alongside his mother when James needed every dollar the boys could earn. Harold worked various jobs: delivery boy for Campbell's General Store earning $2 weekly, dock loader during summer river shipping season at 380 for 12-hour days, and timber cruiser assistant for the Ontario Forest Service, spending weeks in bush country assessing timber stands for harvest viability. This last job, which Harold held seasonally from age 16 to 23, shaped everything that followed. Timber cruising required walking 20 to 30 kilometers daily, through terrain without trails, navigating by compass and landmark recognition, sleeping in canvas tents even when temperatures dropped to -20 Celsius, and hunting for supplementary food because contracted rations provided insufficient calories for the physical demands. Harold learned to shoot with his father's Ross rifle, a straight pull-bolt action, 303 British that Canadian forces had abandoned during the Great War due to jamming issues, but which, when properly maintained, offered accuracy superior to the Lee Enfield that replaced it. Ammunition cost money the family barely had, so every shot counted. Harold developed a patient approach to hunting that woodsmen twice his age respected. He would identify game trails through snow or mud, select concealment positions, offering clear sight lines 30 to 60 meters along the trail, then wait motionless for 2 to 4 hours until deer or moose approached. His personal record, never officially documented but witnessed by other timber cruisers, was remaining absolutely still for 6 hours and 20 minutes in November cold, waiting for a bull moose that field-dressed to 510 pounds and provided meat that fed his crew for 3 weeks. He feared failure more than physical danger, feared returning to camp without game when others depended on his hunting success, feared being the weak link that let the team down. This fear would later manifest in warfare as an almost pathological need to achieve mission objectives, regardless of personal risk. Harold's relationship with his father became strained after Margaret's death. James drank, not constantly, but with grim determination every Saturday night, consuming homemade grain alcohol until he couldn't walk, sleeping it off Sunday, returning to the sawmill Monday with shaking hands and red-rimmed eyes. The mill operated on piece rate quotas, meaning James's alcohol-induced inefficiency reduced family income during recovery days. Harold resented this, resented being forced to quit school while James spent money on alcohol, resented the silent house where nobody mentioned Margaret's name, resented the grinding poverty that made him feel trapped in a life he hadn't chosen. When his brother William joined the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry in August 1939, motivated by $1, 35 daily pay plus room and board that exceeded anything Pembroke offered, Harold initially refused to follow. He had met a girl, Catherine Marie Leblanc, daughter of a French-Canadian merchant who owned a dry goods store, and they had plans, nothing formal but the kind of understanding that young people develop when possibilities seem limited and companionship offers relief from loneliness. Their last conversation before Harold enlisted occurred on June 14, 1940, 4 days after Italy entered the war, and 3 days after Harold received a telegram informing him that William had volunteered for the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, forming for overseas deployment. Catherine asked Harold not to go, said the war would end before Canadian forces ever saw combat, said she needed him here, not bleeding in some European field. Harold told her he couldn't let William face it alone, couldn't be the brother who stayed safe while family fought. He enlisted on June 18, 1940, at the recruitment office in Ottawa, lying about having Catherine's consent, lying about his father's health, lying by omission about his resentment, that circumstances gave him no choice but to trade one form of poverty for another. James's reaction to Harold's enlistment was a 6-word utterance delivered without looking up from repairing a broken saw chain. Try not to die like William will. Harold boarded the train to Valcartier, Quebec on June 24, 1940, carrying a canvas bag containing 2 pairs of socks, 1 spare shirt, his grandfather's straight razor, and a photograph of Catherine that he would lose during training and never have replaced. His father didn't come to the station. Harold's military journey began at Camp Valcartier, where 12,000 recruits transformed from civilians to soldiers through 16 weeks of training that broke bodies and reformed them into instruments optimized for controlled violence. The Canadian Army in 1940 was expanding from a peacetime force of 4,500 to a wartime establishment targeting 5 divisions, totaling 250,000 men, an expansion that strained instructional capacity and equipment availability to breaking. Harold's basic training platoon contained 43 men, ranging from 18 to 37 years old, including unemployed factory workers from Montreal, prairie wheat farmers bankrupted by Depression-era dust bowls, maritime fishermen whose boats had been requisitioned for coastal patrol, and university students whose degrees qualified them for nothing in a depression economy. The training combined obsolete Great War tactics with nascent combined arms doctrine in ratios that frustrated instructors as much as trainees. Harold nearly quit during week 4 after a particularly brutal 28-kilometer march, carrying full kit weighing 36 kilograms through sleet that turned uniforms into semi-frozen shells and caused 17 men to develop trench foot severe enough to require medical treatment. He collapsed at kilometer 23, vomiting from exhaustion and dehydration, unable to stand without assistance, convinced his body couldn't endure what the military demanded. Corporal James Duncan MacLeod, a permanent force instructor who had served in the trenches at Vimy Ridge and bore shrapnel scars across his back that looked like a topographical map of violence, pulled Harold upright and delivered assessment that changed everything. "You're not weak, Thompson. You're thinking like a civilian, trying to endure. You need to think like a machine that operates regardless of input. Pain is data. Exhaustion is data. Neither changes your function. You march because that's your function, not because you feel capable of marching. Now move." This cognitive framework, this separation of physical sensation from operational capability, became Harold's foundational coping mechanism. Harold's selection for sniper training occurred through accident, rather than design. During week 9 marksmanship qualification at the 300-meter range, Harold achieved 38 hits out of 40 rounds in groupings averaging 4.2 centimeters, scores that placed him in the 96th percentile of his training company. Standard protocol placed top shooters into sniper consideration, but what actually secured Harold's selection was an informal competition during a training break when Corporal MacLeod challenged shooters to hit a playing card pinned to a target at 200 meters with iron sights in 15-kilometer-per-hour crosswind. Harold fired 3 rounds, adjusted for wind, and put his 4th round through the center pip of the 7 of diamonds, a shot that MacLeod later described in his recommendation report as indicating intuitive understanding of environmental factors and ballistic adjustment that can't be taught, only recognized and refined. The sniper training wing at Camp Borden, where Harold spent 6 weeks starting November 1940, represented Canada's adaptation of British and Commonwealth lessons from the Great War, with curriculum designed by instructors who remembered the legendary effectiveness of snipers like Francis Pegamagabo, an Ojibwe soldier credited with 378 confirmed kills who had survived the entire war despite spending most of it in the most dangerous position on any battlefield. Training emphasized patience over aggression, concealment over movement, and psychological endurance over physical prowess. Harold learned to construct hides from available materials that rendered him invisible at distances under 5 meters, learned to calculate range using mil-dot reticles and mathematical formulas he'd struggled to understand in school, but now absorbed because failure meant death, learned that effective sniping meant spending 95% of time observing and 5% shooting, learned that the enemy he killed was less important than the fear his presence generated among survivors. His instructor, Lieutenant Charles Edward Morrison, was a veteran of Hong Kong who taught through demonstration rather than lecture, once spending 4 hours motionless in an improvised hide 17 meters from the observation tower while students searched for him, revealing himself only after students abandoned the search, delivering a single lesson that Harold never forgot. Stillness defeats observation. Human eyes detect movement, not presence. Master absolute immotility, and you achieve invisibility. Harold's first experience under fire occurred on July 10, 1943, on the beaches of Sicily during Operation Husky, the Allied invasion designed to knock Italy out of the war and secure Mediterranean shipping lanes. Harold landed with the 1st Canadian Infantry Division at Pacino, southeastern Sicily, hitting the beach at 03:45 hours as part of the 3rd assault wave, expecting devastating fire that never materialized because Italian coastal defenders, demoralized and under-equipped, surrendered in such numbers that prisoner processing became more challenging than combat. The reality of invasion differed completely from training. The beach smelled of diesel fuel, salt water, and human waste from soldiers whose bowel control failed under stress. The surf was rougher than briefings indicated, causing 3 landing craft to broach and drown 11 men in water shallow enough that they could have stood but for equipment weight that pulled them down faster than survival instinct could make them shed it. Harold saw his first corpse within 12 minutes of landing, a Canadian engineer from New Brunswick, whose name Harold never learned, whose body lay at the waterline with one leg severed above the knee by a mine fragment, uniform torn open to reveal intestines protruding like obscene rope, eyes still open, and staring at nothing while surf washed over him in rhythmic mockery of breathing. Harold felt nothing, not horror, not pity, not fear, only a strange numbness that frightened him more than the corpse itself, because he'd expected to feel something profound when confronted with violent death. The first person Harold watched die occurred 6 days later during the advance toward Piazza Armerina. His platoon moved through wheat fields along Highway 117 when German defenders from the Hermann Göring Division initiated a pre-planned ambush with machine gun fire from positions 300 meters distant. Private Thomas Arthur Wilson, a 20-year-old from Regina who'd worked as a grocery clerk and who collected stamps as hobby and who'd shown Harold photographs of his fiancée 3 nights earlier, took 3 rounds from an MG-42 across his chest and throat while standing less than 2 meters from Harold. One moment Wilson was moving forward in the tactical column, the next he was on his back, making sounds that Harold's mind refused to process as human, hands clutching at his throat while blood sprayed between fingers with each heartbeat, eyes locked on Harold's face with expression that begged for help Harold couldn't provide. Wilson died in 47 seconds, though Harold's perception of time stretched it to eternity. That night Harold vomited everything in his stomach, then sat awake until dawn asking himself if he could continue doing this for however long the war lasted. The answer, when it came, wasn't courage or patriotism or hatred of the enemy. It was the simple recognition that returning home after quitting wasn't survivable from a psychological standpoint, that he'd rather die than face his father and Catherine and tell them he'd failed. This fear of judgment became Harold's primary motivator, more powerful than survival instinct. Harold's progression from adequate soldier to proficient sniper occurred through 4 specific engagements. First, August 3, 1943, outside Agira, Sicily, when he killed a German machine gunner at 342 meters, who was pinning down Harold's company, shot taken prone with hasty rest, 1 round through the upper chest that produced immediate cessation of fire and allowed the company to advance. Second, August 17th, during the approach to Messina, when Harold spent 6 hours in an olive grove observing a German headquarters position, identifying officers through patient surveillance, then killing 3 in succession at ranges between 180 and 230 meters as they emerged from a command tent, each shot producing immediate collapse and chaos that disrupted defensive coordination during critical hours. Third, September 9th, during the Salerno landings where Canadian forces provided artillery support, when Harold eliminated a German forward observer who was directing devastatingly accurate fire against Allied positions, shot taken at 412 meters in 15-kilometer crosswind, 1 round that ended a threat no amount of counter-battery fire could suppress. Fourth, November 28th, during preliminary operations before Ortona, when Harold was tasked with eliminating a particularly effective German sniper who'd killed 7 Canadians over 3 days. Harold spent 11 hours tracking his counterpart through rubble, identifying patterns in his movement, predicting his next position, then waiting motionless for 96 minutes until the German sniper shifted position, exposing himself for 2-3 seconds, enough time for Harold to put 1 round through the German's head at 267 meters. This kill changed everything because it demonstrated that Harold could outthink and outlast someone equally trained, equally motivated, equally skilled. After November 28th, Harold no longer felt like a soldier playing sniper. He had become something else entirely, something without a proper name in military doctrine. The weapon that transformed Harold Thompson from competent sniper into psychological warfare operator was officially designated Rifle Number 4 MKEA-T, a Lee Enfield, modified for telescopic sight mounting and accurized through selective assembly from standard production rifles that demonstrated exceptional accuracy during proof testing. For military logisticians, it was one of 26,141 sniper rifles produced between 1941 and 1945. For Harold, it was simply the rifle, individualized through countless hours of use and maintenance, until it responded to his inputs with the predictability of an extension of his own nervous system. The number 4 MKEA-T fired the .303 British cartridge, a rimmed bottleneck round measuring 56 millimeters in length with bullet weight of 174 grains, propelled by 37 grains of cordite, generating muzzle velocity of 2,140 feet per second and muzzle energy of 2,400 foot-pounds. In concrete terms, this meant that the bullet exited the barrel faster than a commercial jetliner at cruising speed, carrying kinetic energy equivalent to a 1-kilogram steel ball dropped from 66 meters. When this projectile impacted human tissue, it didn't simply penetrate. It created a temporary wound cavity through hydraulic shock that destroyed tissue in a cone radiating from the permanent wound channel, often 30 to 40 millimeters in diameter, despite the bullet itself measuring only 7.7 millimeters. The bullet's boat tail design tapering from 7.7 millimeters to 6.9 millimeters over the rear 18 millimeters of its length, reduced aerodynamic drag by 17% compared to flat-based designs, maintaining supersonic velocity to 600 meters and remaining lethal to 1,400 meters, even though accuracy degraded beyond 600 meters due to transition to subsonic flight and the associated instability. The telescopic sight, manufactured by either REL or Holland & Holland, depending on procurement batch, offered 3.5x magnification through optical assembly, containing 6 elements in 3 groups, providing field of view of 8.2 degrees and eye relief of 76 millimeters. Light transmission through the coated lenses reached 86%, meaning that in conditions where the human eye could barely distinguish detail, the sight gathered and concentrated available light to render targets visible. The reticle consisted of a simple post with tapered point, subtending 3.5 minutes of angle at the aiming point, coarse enough to avoid obscuring targets at distance, but refined enough to allow precise aim point selection. Crucially, the sight mounted offset to the left rather than centerline, necessitating a canting technique when shooting that felt unnatural to marksmen trained on centerline mounted optics, but which allowed the rifle to maintain its magazine capacity and didn't require modification to the bolt, preserving reliability and rate of fire. The rifle's trigger, hand-selected for crisp break without creep, required exactly 4.1 pounds of pressure to release the sear, consistent enough that Harold could predict the exact instant of discharge and compensate for any involuntary muscle tension. The barrel, cold hammer forged from ordnance steel and hand-lapped to remove microscopic imperfections, measured 640 millimeters and was selected from production lots, where test firing demonstrated groups under 2.5 inches at 100 yards, translating to potential accuracy of 0.7 minutes of angle under ideal conditions, though battlefield conditions rarely approached ideal. The stock, machined from walnut with moisture content, controlled to 12% and reinforced at stress points with steel crossbolts, provided consistent point of impact through temperature and humidity variations that would cause lesser stocks to warp and shift zero. The complete rifle weighed 18 kilograms loaded with a 10-round magazine, 900 grams heavier than a standard No. 4 rifle, but still light enough for extended carry during dismounted operations. This weight distribution, with center of gravity positioned 304 millimeters forward of the buttstock, created natural muzzle stability when firing from supported positions while remaining maneuverable during rapid target transitions. The development of Canadian sniper doctrine that made the No. TIC devastatingly effective began not with official programs, but with field modifications and tactical innovations that commanders later formalized into training. Event 1 occurred in January 1941 at Aldershot, England, where Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Augustus Lister, commanding officer of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, observed British sniper training and concluded that the 3-week course emphasized mechanical shooting skills while neglecting the hunting mentality that he'd witnessed among Canadian soldiers from rural backgrounds. Lister, who'd grown up in Manitoba hunting elk and caribou, understood that hunting wasn't simply shooting, it was reading terrain, predicting behavior, exercising patience that urbanized Europeans rarely developed. He initiated informal training within his battalion that emphasized stalking over shooting, teaching snipers to spend days observing enemy patterns before engaging, to prioritize targets based on tactical disruption rather than simply opportunity, and to view themselves as psychological operators who killed selectively to produce maximum fear rather than maximum body count. His approach violated British doctrine, but produced results. Event 2 occurred in April 1941, during defensive exercises in southern England, when Private William Edward Breckenridge, a trapper from northern Ontario, demonstrated concealment techniques he developed hunting fur-bearing animals in terrain where the prey possessed hearing and smell far superior to humans. Breckenridge constructed a hide using local vegetation that British instructors literally walked past at 3 meters without detection, then remained in position for 14 hours without movement detectable by observers who knew his approximate location. When debriefed, Breckenridge explained that trappers learned absolute stillness because any movement transmitted through frozen ground as vibration that alert animals detected, that successful concealment required thinking like the prey's nervous system rather than like a soldier hiding from other soldiers. His techniques were documented and incorporated into 1st Canadian Division training protocols. Event 3 occurred in July 1941, when Captain Howard Graham MacDonald, an engineering officer with pre-war experience as surveyor in British Columbia, developed range estimation techniques adapted from topographical surveying that proved more accurate than mil-dot methods taught in conventional sniper training. MacDonald recognized that human visual perception of vertical angles remained more consistent than horizontal estimation, so he trained snipers to estimate range by calculating the angle subtended by a target of known height rather than using apparent size alone. This technique, which required only ability to estimate angles within 10% accuracy, allowed snipers to determine range within 8% error at distances up to 500 meters, compared to 15 to 20% error using conventional estimation methods. MacDonald's techniques became standard in Canadian sniper training by September 1941. Event 4 occurred in December 1941, when Lieutenant Gerald Michael Fitzgerald, a mathematics instructor from McGill University serving with the Royal Canadian Regiment, calculated firing solutions for snipers engaging targets from elevated positions in urban terrain, developing correction factors that compensated for the ballistic effects of shooting at significant angle relative to horizontal. Conventional training taught shooters to aim low when firing downward, because gravity affected the bullet differently, over slant range versus horizontal range. But Fitzgerald's calculations demonstrated that this correction was smaller than commonly believed, and that many shooters were overcorrecting and missing low. He developed a simple formula: true horizontal range equals slant range times cosine of angle. Use horizontal range for ballistic calculation. This formula, simple enough that soldiers could calculate it mentally, improved first-round hit probability on elevated targets from 41% to 67% in testing. Event 5, the breakthrough that tied everything together, occurred in March 1942 during training on the Isle of Wight, when Sergeant Robert Francis Mackenzie, who'd worked as wildlife photographer before the war, realized that German defensive doctrine created predictable patterns in officer movement. Mackenzie spent 2 weeks observing German positions across the Channel, using high-powered optics, documenting the timing and locations where officers appeared, then analyzing the data to identify patterns. He discovered that German officers conducting defensive inspections appeared at forward observation posts at predictable intervals, typically in late afternoon when lighting conditions favored observation, that they remained at observation points for 7 to 12 minutes, conducting surveillance and issuing instructions, and that they followed routes optimized for efficiency rather than unpredictability. Mackenzie developed engagement protocols: observe for minimum 2 days to establish patterns, select firing positions with escape routes pre-planned, engage when officers were stationary rather than moving to maximize hit probability, fire only 1 shot regardless of outcome to avoid revealing position, relocate immediately after engagement. These protocols became formalized doctrine. Event 6 involved production allocation in June 1942, when Canadian Military Command secured priority production of 1,200 additional number 4 MKYT rifles from British facilities, arguing that Canadian divisions contained disproportionate numbers of soldiers with hunting backgrounds who could effectively employ sniper rifles without extensive training. Cost per rifle was $23 including telescopic sight, compared to $3 for standard infantry rifles, representing a nearly 8-fold cost multiplier that required explicit justification to budget authorities focused on equipping mass armies. The allocation was approved after Colonel Lister presented casualty analysis from exercises, showing that a sniper team could achieve tactical effects equivalent to an 8-man infantry section while suffering 1/8 the casualty rate, making the cost differential justifiable on casualty reduction grounds alone. Event 7 occurred in August 1942 after the Dieppe raid, when analysis of German defensive effectiveness revealed that Canadian forces had suffered 3,367 casualties in 9 hours, including 907 killed, many due to German machine gun teams and forward observers who directed artillery fire. Intelligence officers examining after-action reports calculated that eliminating specific high-value targets could have reduced casualties by estimated 23 to 31%, that German defensive coordination depended on officers visible to snipers for cumulative duration of 43 minutes during the raid, and that conventional infantry lacked weapons to engage these targets effectively while under fire. This analysis produced formal doctrine. Each Canadian infantry company would include a sniper section of 4 two-man teams. These teams would deploy independently rather than as infantry support. They would prioritize targets based on tactical disruption methodology developed by Lister, and they would operate under rules of engagement, emphasizing patience and psychological impact over engagement frequency. The system worked like this. First, reconnaissance phase lasting 24 to 72 hours, where sniper teams inserted into positions offering observation of German defensive zones, not to shoot, but solely to document patterns of enemy activity. Teams recorded every observable enemy movement, noting time, location, apparent rank, activity, and duration, creating a pattern-of-life database that revealed predictable behaviors and high-value targets. This phase required equipment that standard infantry didn't carry: notebooks with waterproof paper for detailed logging, watches synchronized to divisional time for correlation of observations across multiple teams, binoculars with 10x magnification that allowed target identification at ranges exceeding rifle capability, and thermal clothing that enabled motionless observation in cold conditions that would incapacitate conventional infantry through hypothermia. Intelligence officers taught snipers to think like analysts rather than shooters, to recognize that comprehensive observation data was more valuable than hasty shots at targets of opportunity, that patience during reconnaissance multiplied effectiveness during engagement. Harold Thompson's reconnaissance logs from November 1943, recovered post-war and preserved in Canadian military archives, contain 17 pages of handwritten observations documenting 243 separate German troop movements, 46 vehicle movements, and detailed descriptions of 31 individual German soldiers, including estimates of rank, equipment, and behavioral patterns, recorded over 5 days without firing a single shot. Second, target prioritization using a mathematical scoring system that quantified tactical value, where forward observers and officers received scores of 8 to 10, machine gun crews scored 5 to 7, vehicle crews scored 4 to 6, and ordinary infantry scored 1 to 3. Teams were explicitly instructed to ignore targets scoring below 4, regardless of shot availability, because revealing sniper positions to kill low-value targets was tactically counterproductive, trading strategic advantage for minimal gain. This doctrine fundamentally differed from German and Soviet sniper employment, where engagement frequency and kill counts determined sniper effectiveness, and commanders incentivized high body counts through awards and recognition. Canadian doctrine emphasized that snipers functioned as psychological operators whose primary effect was fear and behavioral modification in enemy forces rather than attrition through casualties. Analysis from Ortona campaign demonstrated this effect. German units known to be operating in Canadian sniper engagement zones showed 41% reduction in daylight officer activity, 67% increase in time required to complete tactical movements due to emphasis on covered routes, and measurable degradation in artillery effectiveness because forward observers reduced exposure time from average 12 minutes per observation session to average 4 minutes insufficient. Time for comprehensive target assessment. Third, firing position selection using criteria that prioritized escape and concealment over optimal firing angle. Canadian doctrine mandated that firing positions must offer at least 2 escape routes, must allow undetected withdrawal within 90 seconds of shot, must provide concealment from ground-level observation at ranges under 20 meters, and must offer clear sight lines to target areas identified during reconnaissance. Snipers were trained to occupy positions for minimum 6 hours before engaging to allow enemy forces to become accustomed to the environment and cease active counter-sniper observation, essentially hiding in plain sight by remaining motionless long enough that the position became part of the landscape in enemy cognitive mapping. This patience was explicitly taught through exercises where instructors penalized students for engaging before 6-hour minimums, even if high-value targets presented themselves, reinforcing that tactical discipline trumped opportunity. Harold Thompson's personal record, documented but never officially recognized because it violated direct orders to engage, was remaining in position for 19 hours and 37 minutes in December 1943, watching a German battalion command post, logging activities, identifying patterns, but not firing because divisional orders had specified no engagement during the observation period, a restraint that required psychological conditioning few soldiers possessed. Fourth, shot execution using standardized procedures that reduced the firing sequence to mechanical precision, eliminating variability through repetition and protocol. The sequence: confirm range using McDonald's angular technique, calculate wind deflection using mil-dot hold-off if crosswind exceeded 8 km per hour, control breathing to fire during natural respiratory pause after exhalation when diaphragm muscles were relaxed, apply trigger pressure gradually over 2 to 3 seconds while maintaining sight picture, follow through by maintaining trigger rearward pressure for full second after discharge to avoid disturbing rifle during recoil, observe impact through scope to confirm hit or calculate correction if follow-up shot was necessary. Canadian doctrine emphasized that this entire sequence should occur in 6 to 9 seconds from decision to fire until impact observation, fast enough that the target remained stationary, but slow enough that the shooter maintained absolute technical control. Training included firing exercises where students were timed and penalized for rushing, reinforcing that speed without precision was worthless. Harold Thompson's qualification scores from Camp Borden documented his firing sequence averaging 7.2 seconds with first-round hit probability of 86% at 300 meters and 64% at 500 meters, compared to doctrinal standards of 80% at 300 meters and 50% at 500 meters. Fifth, immediate withdrawal using pre-planned routes that assumed enemy forces would direct fire at the shooting position within 15 to 30 seconds of shot, a realistic expectation given that muzzle flash, sound, and dust signature betrayed position to any observer within 90-degree arc of line of fire. Doctrine specified that snipers must displace minimum 50 meters from firing position within 60 seconds, moving via covered routes that broke line of sight with enemy positions, reaching rally points where observer partners provided security and additional eyes during withdrawal. The emphasis on withdrawal speed seemed counterintuitive to soldiers trained in conventional infantry tactics, where maintaining positions after contact was standard, but sniper doctrine recognized that a sniper's value was sustained effectiveness over days and weeks rather than holding terrain, that a dead sniper achieved zero future tactical effect regardless of how many enemies he killed before dying. Statistics from Italian campaign demonstrated doctrine effectiveness. Canadian sniper casualty rate was 4.2 per 100 deployed snipers over the 7-month campaign, compared to 31.6 casualties per 100 for infantry and 8.7 per 100 for German snipers, who often operated under doctrine emphasizing position defense over mobility. This wasn't simply marksmanship transformed into military terminology. It was hunting methodology combined with industrial analysis to create systematic psychological warfare. Where traditional military sniping focused on eliminating enemies, Canadian doctrine focused on disrupting enemy decision-making processes by removing decision-makers and creating pervasive uncertainty about when and where snipers might engage. The effectiveness ratio told the story. Across the Italian campaign from September 1943 to May 1945, Canadian sniper teams averaging 112 deployed at any given time were credited with 2,847 confirmed kills, verified through observer confirmation or post-action battlefield assessment, representing 25 kills per sniper over the campaign duration, but tactical impact analysis suggested the real effect was multiplicative. German documents captured after the war included after-action reports noting that officer casualties in sectors facing Canadian forces ran 43% higher than sectors facing British or American forces of equivalent size, that defensive coordination suffered measurably when officers reduced exposure, and that forward observer effectiveness declined by estimate.